Ladies and gentlemen, could you take your seats? We are shortly to start. Good afternoon, distinguished excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests. I now open this segment where we will hear national statements on topic of just transition and energy transition. I would like to urge distinguished speakers to kindly observe a 3-minute time slot for statements during this segment. Dear distinguished excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, let us start. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. George Rivera Staff, Secretary of Energy of Panama. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Good afternoon to everyone. Am I going in Spanish? Okay, thank you very much. Gracias. Creo que me va a ser...
I think it's going to be easier to respect the time in Spanish. First, it is a great pleasure for the government of Panama and President Cortizo and the organizers to have you here from the National Energy Secretariat and the Director of Public Energy from our country. We are boosting an ambitious energy transition agenda by 2030 aligned with SDGs from UN and our commitments with the Paris Agreement. This energy transition agenda is an action plan established for 2030 with 7 national strategies, 30 goals, 60 lines of action, and 262 specific lines of actions, allowing us to establish an action plan that we can follow up, measure, and monitor our commitments involving universal access to energy, electricity, energy efficiency, innovation of the system, and green hydrogen. This is a process that we are carrying out with the last NDC that Panama sent in 2020. 95% of the quantitative commitments measurable to reduce emissions in our country come from the energy sector. And just like most of the countries in Latin America, from the energy sector in transportation. In our case, to generate electricity, the average is 80% of renewable energies. In that case, consolidating our position as a carbon negative country. We want to close the gap to access energy. This is important for the sustainable and green transition, and also a just transition for all the Panamanian citizens. This is the process that we are planning aligned with the UN SDGs and SDG 7, of course, as well with the national commitments. Working jointly, we are also driving the expansion of the ambition of our countries in the climate goals, also developing the mitigation commitment, and as of next year, as part of our NDC commitment, we have an adaptation plan to climate change on behalf of the energy sector, one of the first countries in the region developing this project. We have a concrete action plan that allows us somehow to consolidate these efforts to have a long-term energy policy, allowing us to become a dream into a reality in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now I want to welcome Her Excellency Mrs. Maria Susana Muhammad Gonzalez, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. In 3 minutes, I would like to convey 3 key messages. A just energy transition is not only a change in the energy matrix, including mobility. It also involves an economic transformation. Colombia is the 5th carbon exporter in the world, and it depends on it for their fiscal balance. The question is, if an economy that unfortunately has increased its dependency on extractivism, will it survive in the changes on the 21st century? Therefore, an energy transition involves a transformation of productive sectors to generate a re-industrialization, to generate employment in the country next to the most important assets we have in Colombia, like biodiversity, where topics like nature tourism at international scale is one of the sectors that is going to drive a transformation. Second, renewables, to generate enough energy to sustain the country and also to export renewable energies. This involves the changes in agriculture that must equal adaptation and food security, and the changes in the transportation energy matrix, so our refineries can adapt to a different vision with other types of fuels like green hydrogen. I would like to highlight that this involves a mining policy. We are passing a bill on mining because there is a superposition of minerals in protected areas and the biodiversity hotspots in the country. This involves a problem in development that will create a change in the mining policy from a mining for exportation and extractivism into a strategic mining to industrialize the country in productive chains moving into the industry and agriculture. In conclusion, the problem for a just energy transition and their specificities in the region is not only a problem of changing a technology for other. It means an ecologic change, and it also means a different way of living under different energy parameters. And the question is, if these are the conversations that we are having at the international level, we want to bring a portfolio of the socio-ecological and energy transition to the COP, so we can translate it into a portfolio for investment where the public sector strengthens and creates clear rules so the private investment can reach these transformations. We have the time, we have the ability. The question is, can we plan so we can do it without creating large economic gaps, employment gaps, regional gaps, or inequalities? This is a question that someone mentioned today. This is not something that we can do by ourselves. Reason why we need multilateral agreements to allow these transitions in the difficult times we're living now.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is now my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Mrs. Marta Rojas Corradi, Minister of Environment of Chile. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This year could be a symbolic year with high temperatures, and we are getting dangerously close to 1.5. The First Minister of Samoa said that the storm is gaining strength. With that reality, this year we understand that the region of Latin America and the Caribbean has a high level of vulnerability. But not only that, but we also depend of the exploitation and exportation of raw material like minerals, hydrocarbons, and food, increasing vulnerabilities because of inequalities of territories that have to deal with such impacts beyond the climate change. The case of Chile, there are some territories that we have called areas of sacrifice or calling, with high concentration of productive activities and high level of pollution. To the fact that I am going to read that the environmental degradation affects the effective enjoyment of human rights. Groups of people that are already living in vulnerable situations their rights can be violated in the case of environmental aspects. Therefore, the states have the obligation to respect, protect, and ensure the autonomous right for a healthy environment with the principles of equality and non-discrimination. And with this reality, that I'm sure that it also replicates throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, is that in Chile, we have started talking not only about a just transition, but also about a just socio-ecological transition. I will read the definition. This transition is a process of transformation and or adaptation of the socio-cultural systems into the ecosystemic balance, the well-being of the people, and sustainable productive models. In the framework of the triple crisis, climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and pollution, always ensuring a focus on human rights, gender equity, and decent work. This goes beyond that decent work. We must include the human rights approach. I remember that as a region as well, we have a treaty for that. We have the LACCW treaty, and this is a human right treaty on environmental aspects that helps us as a base to do the job we have to do. To be concrete, this transition is being done in 5 territories. 5 territories with carbon thermoelectric plants. And due to the framework law of climate change, the plants are going to close. Therefore, the possibilities of imagining a future different from now, imagining a new economic model in those regions, this is where we want to exemplify the socio-ecologic transition. And with those examples of the meaning that we give it, we hope to have a productive and fruitful conversation with a common outlook of the region to face this triple crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And it's now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. José Antonio Dávalos, Minister of Environment, Water and Ecological Transition of Ecuador. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Muy buenas.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will try to abide to the 3 minutes granted. It is no secret that nowadays we are all facing a critical time in history, and all decisions made, including those decisions coming out of this forum, without a doubt, will have a great impact in our future, not only in environmental aspects, but also in terms of social justice, economic justice. Our countries are dealing with an urgent need to transition to new energy sources that are clean, sustainable, and of course, considering the social cohesion and economic resilience. And now that we all understand and live the effects of climate change, it is crucial to start the just and ecologic transition that requires our governments to have sectorial planning, considering the creation of employments and to readdress our institutions and our public policies. My country, Ecuador, is a clear example. It is no secret that we are going through a crisis, an energy crisis in Ecuador. In fact, we have been forced to go to our sister country, Colombia, for energy. And this is because in our intention to transition into clean energies, we have depended on our hydroelectric plants. However, a few years ago, when these plants were built, we never considered the adaptation to climate change and how the droughts were going to affect us. And this is a clear lesson in history for us and for the entire region. The just transition that we all seek, transitioning to new methods of generating electric energy, must consider the climate change as a factor when we plan. As a country, we have taken steps into this transition, but I insist, we have learned from history and now we can plan into the future. However, now we are facing this problem. Thank God we have great neighbors and we have been able to get out of this. We not only need public policies, but we need to work with the private sector. We need to have commitments from our communities, our enterprises, so we can be more rational in the way we use the energy. In Ecuador, we have programs that through climate change consider a sustainable production, a cleaner production on behalf of our companies as a commitment to offset or to create an offset scheme of a GHG, hoping this is a possible solution to reach the just transition. I feel proud to say that in Ecuador, we are looking at natural resources with a long-term vision, having responsibility to our future generations, and especially trying to have a green growth as an alternative of equitable and just development for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency, Mrs. Albina Ruiz, Minister of Environment of Peru. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. The will of our region is to work for its population to enjoy a healthy environment in harmony with a sustainable economic growth. In order to achieve this, we must drive a just transition, complementing actions to carbon neutrality and climate resiliency. Today, we make a call for the climate transition to include economic, social, and environmental aspects, to hear all the voices, especially the voices of the youth and women, including the most vulnerable, the rural and indigenous women. Deforestation continues increasing, adding illegal activities like illegal mining, trafficking of land, and drug trafficking. In this sense, Peru has created a climate fund for the benefit of indigenous women in order to drive their inclusion in the just transition, giving it a face of a woman. Through this, we will be able to strengthen the capacities of close to 3 million indigenous women in the adaptation and mitigation, and this is going to be presented in the COP28. We call for all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to join this initiative. An example of just transition is the use of photovoltaic energy in the cold chain in community Candosi, Loreto. This is a remote area in the Amazonas without access to energy. In 2022, it produced 120,000 kilos of ice to transport 250 tons of fishing to local markets. This way, I make a call for the countries in the region to replicate this experience so we can drive the use of renewable energies and contribute to the well-being of our people. By doing so, we can boost opportunities through the eco and bio businesses, adding value to our biodiversity using renewable energy and facilitating a just energy transition. Peru has carried out different actions. First, the creation of a technical team for just transition in the National Commission of Climate Change, comprised by the National Committee of Women and Climate Change, the Ministry of Energy and Mining, the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights, trade unions, the youth, indigenous peoples, the private sector, and the Ministry of Environment. Second, the creation of high-level commission for climate change led by the president of the Council of Ministries, comprised by the 18 ministers of all the executive power. The Ministry of Labor and Employment Promotion has the task to contribute to the just transition and decent work. Third, the implementation of the platform of indigenous peoples to face climate change. This is a unique space worldwide as part of the climate governance in Peru, with the participation of the representative organizations of indigenous peoples, where they discuss responses and proposals to climate change mitigation, including their ancestral practices. It is important to mention that Peru is not only focusing these efforts into a just transition from mitigation. We have worked on measures on mitigation, like water, like the efficient harnessing of water and basins. We hope to reduce adverse effects in the alteration of the water availability in the generation, transmission, and energy distribution. For this, we need to quantify our results and advances through sustainability indicators, given that what we cannot measure, we cannot manage, especially in the implementation process for the NDCs. We are sure that this is not a unique effort. All the sectors in the region must include these indicators associated to sustainability and climate change. In this sense, I make a call for the international cooperation to join these efforts. Peru is also working in the update of the long-term strategy with a vision to 2050 named National Strategy Facing the Climate Change, addressing adaptation, mitigation, and will have public services, including the action facing climate change, complementing other sectorial policies. Finally, I would like to call on other countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, including the non-state actors, to work together in a just transition and energy, making our voices more powerful worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Mr. João Paulo Capobianco Vice Minister of Environment of Brazil. Mr. Capobianco, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes a todos y todas.
Good afternoon, everyone. Extreme events in Latin America and the Caribbean set clear that we have no time to waste. There's no doubt that we are living a crisis already. The climate change, the loss of biodiversity, water pollution, poverty, hunger, and violence. As climate change is worsening the poverty, the loss of biodiversity is also affecting the lives of the peoples and communities and the forests. In Latin America, we know that in order to promote a just transition, we need to face those challenges in a cross-cutting, a comprehensive way. We have the ethical, moral, and political obligation to follow a global path where the social economic emissions are equally integrated. We need to promote this vision worldwide, including the necessary urgency to advance the environmental agenda with a challenge to reduce poverty and support the most vulnerable in the process of ecologic transition. In order to promote an equitable and just transition, we not only need to mitigate the effects of climate change, but we also need to transform our economic models and the way we relate to nature. This model must be based on a new way of cooperation that could help us to leave the cycle of negative realities and step into the cycle of positive realities. We must transform the comparative advantages of our region and distributive advantages for the benefit of the collective and our planet, always showing support and the necessary cooperation so we can implement this vision. In our region, the environmental agenda is at the core, taking care of the Amazonian forest. The Amazonia and the ecosystemic sectors are fundamental for the climate regulation and for our region in particular. It is believed that about 75% of the GDP in South America depends on the services provided by the Amazonia. As a reflect of this renewed commitment, we have assumed the ambitious goal of net zero by 2030. The area under alert for deforestation in the Amazonia dropped 48% compared to the same period in the previous year. The preliminary calculation states that the reduction of deforestation in the first few months in Brazil avoided the emission of about 200 million of CO2. In that same sense, we call for a summit in Belém that brought the presidents in the region working on a renewed political and technical agenda. One of the fundamental elements to promote just transition in our context is to elevate the social role of economy, promoting productive relations based on the valuing of our biodiversity and the respect and fostering of indigenous peoples and national communities, offering better access to employment, to the market, and biodiversity products. This is a way we can support to those at the front line. Another important aspect is to value and promote the movement of eco-global systems with the guardians of the forests to ensure a just and inclusive transition for all, allowing an advancement into a new cycle of prosperity. Both aspects are going to be highlighted during the presidency of Brazil in the G20, giving priority to the aspects of facing poverty and rescue the three pillars of sustainable development and the function of multilaterals with fundamental elements on just transition. We will create a working group for climate funding, and we will find a reform based on sustainability in all the missions in an ambitious way. COP30 in the city of Belém, despite of the symbolic character, is going to mention the challenges, the shared challenges, not only by the Amazonian countries, but also by the tropical countries in different contexts. This is going to be a call for action to work on the necessary mobilization for the effective protection of our ecosystems with the promotion of better life conditions for our people. I would like to highlight that we can fight poverty. And this cannot be a problem that we cannot work on. It involves a real development more balanced and equitable for all, guided by human rights and social and environmental elements.
Thank you, Mr. Copa Bianco. It is now my pleasure to welcome Mr. Kisham Kumarshin, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreement Unit, Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Kumarshin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. For us in Trinidad and Tobago, as many of you may know, the economy relies largely on energy basis, oil, gas, and petrochemicals. And therefore, the energy transition for us would pose some challenges. Our nationally determined contribution, as you may also know, consists of reduction by 30% of cumulative emissions relative to a business as usual baseline in three sectors: the power generation, industry, and transportation sector by 2030. We have already begun to implement various aspects in the three sectors, which are largely based on energy availability. But for us, in recognition of the energy transition, comes with it the recognition that in that transition also has some expected but also some unintended consequences. So we have developed, for example, a just transition of the workforce policy already, which is before the cabinet for approval. And that policy speaks to largely retooling, reschooling, and reskilling the existing workforce so that the unintended consequences, the socioeconomic consequences of labor issues can be buffered. But it's not only about the energy workers, it's also for us about those communities who are already involved in livelihoods that are based on natural resources, the fishers, for example. And if there is as there is likely to be, and there already is, impacts of climate change on those sectors, then those communities will also be disenfranchised, much like the energy transition will have on the energy-based workers. So our approach to the energy transition does not have a narrow view, looking at emissions alone, but also looking at the impacts of climate change on those communities that may be disenfranchised. And that is premised on the expressed concept in the Paris Agreement of leaving no one behind and addressing the particularly vulnerable groups and communities. We think that the energy transition is something that we all know is critically important for achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 temperature goal, but also that in order to do that, the world needs to embark on an accelerated energy transition. But even on that course, that will also prove challenging to some economies. So for us, for example, we already generate our electricity by natural gas using efficiently produced combined cycle, for example. The next step for us in power generation is only one way to go. It's renewable energy, and we're about to construct the largest solar plant in the English-speaking Caribbean, about 112 megawatts, and there are plans, at least policy intentions, to up that to 30% by 2030, with the 112 representing about between 8 to 10%. We already have an electric mobility policy as well that have taken off all import duties and taxes applicable to purchases of electric vehicles. And in tandem with the adoption of a feed-in tariff policy that will allow households and commercial entities to generate their own electricity and feed onto the grid, we see that working synergistically to reduce emissions and hasten the energy transition. We are about the third largest exporter of fertilizers to the EU, and with the already implemented pilot phase of the carbon border adjustment measures, it is likely and it will have impacts on the competitiveness of the goods that we export. And in recognition of that, we have devised a roadmap for green hydrogen development. And we already have a totally private sector-led initiative and funded initiative to generate green hydrogen, with the first, perhaps, production being in 2027. So the energy transition, while it is ongoing, poses challenges as well for economies that are sensitive to changes in the energy matrix. It goes beyond that, as I said, with respect to the adverse impacts of climate change. And we think that with catalyzed and strong just transition policies in countries, that it can hasten the energy transition, it can buffer some of the impacts, and that brings me to some expectations for COP28. We think that a strong and robust outcome on the Just Transition Work Program that will address all of the issues that are pertinent to countries, even small island states that really have very minuscule emissions profiles, that they should be given access, at least easy access to renewable energy, for example, renewable energy technology, the capacity, the human resources, and so on. So at COP28, we hope that a strong outcome on the Just Transition Work Program can actually work to catalyze the energy transition, because the major concerns about that transition is really socioeconomic impacts. And with a well-designed Just Transition Work Program, we think that can catalyze the energy transition at a rate that is now required to keep the trajectory to 1.5 under the Paris Agreement in view and on track. So we expect and we hope that with that outcome, that other countries would vigorously adopt policies to address the issues of just transition, and by so doing, accelerate and catalyze the energy transition so that the world at large can benefit from the individual actions of countries. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kuman Singh. I would now like to welcome statements from partner organizations and civil society. To start, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Manuel Pulgar Vidal, High-Level Champions Global Ambassador. Mr. Pulgar Vidal, you have the floor.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Allow me to frame my intervention under the title Latin America and the Just Transition, with some key ideas to strengthen leadership. My first idea is that Latin America has been and should continue being the leader of the climate agenda. Throughout time, Mexico reviving the climate process, Peru leading the way, Chile giving strength to the climate change agenda and connecting economy and climate. And I'm sure that Brazil have set the pace. And a just energy transition is one of the common elements for a Latin America agenda to maintain that leadership. Second, this leadership must be strengthened if we are able to involve actively the non-state actors. Let us remember that the non-state actors agenda is created in Lima, 2014, with the Climate Lima Paris agenda and COP25, organized by Chile with a clear mandate to the champions. Therefore, we must work together with the partners and the champions of the action agenda so we can continue promoting such leadership. Third idea, we are aware that the climate debate and the just energy transition is a political debate, is a social debate, but it is also an economic debate. And as we are more capable to understand the connection that this debate has to economy and development, will be able to lead a just energy transition. Chile, with Finland in 2018, launched the Coalition of Finance Ministries for Climate, adhering to the Helsinki Principles, and then launched the Santiago Action Plan. We must continue involving finance ministers in the climate debate so the just energy transition becomes a reality. Fourth idea, there is a group of actions for the climate change agenda. I am an ambassador for such agenda today. We must activate the sub-region and each one of our countries. The race towards zero, the race to resilience, the ambitious sectorial plan are initiatives, campaigns, and ideas that foster the involvement of the non-state actors in the compliance of goals that at the same time constitute public policies for each one of our countries. Fifth idea, we are aware that Latin America is small on emissions, but let's forget about that piece of data. It is not important how big or small emissions are, but how I see myself in 2050. Therefore, we must outline our vision. It is clear that Latin America has, as the end user, a high ratio of renewable energies. However, we are still a sub-region with the primary energy offer still is fossil fuel. And we must change that. We must be aware that the gradual exit from fossil fuel is an unavoidable reality. And if we don't want to lose the GDP, we need to walk those transitions. ECLAC said it in 2019. 20 to 25% of structural loss of the GDP is going to happen in Latin America if we do not move into the transition with climate responsibility. 6, we need to have programs activating financial mechanisms, and this is a clear message from the champions. This means mechanisms related to debt, reform of the systems of the multilateral banking for development, and establishing ways to generate that regulation, generating the right incentive for the change that we are all seeking. 7, we need to adhere to the dialogues that the champions of the action agenda are promoting. There is a dialogue in this week. And in that sense, there is a call from the champions, from the action agenda, to triple the non-conventional energies by 2030 and double the energy efficiency. We have forgotten that it's not only about non-conventional renewable energies, but also energy efficiency. I'm sure that I'm well over my 3 minutes, but allow me to say that we must connect the just energy transition to two things. First, the impact it has on nature. This is a core element, and we need to make sure that the development or the installation of non-conventional renewable energy will not affect the ecosystems, neither biodiversity, because Latin America is biodiversity rich, and we need to respect the global framework adopted last year. And just like the Minister of Colombia mentioned, we need to do the right analysis for the rules. This is a core element. 8 ideas, and I'm sure that will make from Latin America a leader region on climate change and energy transition. We just need to be aware that we are leaders and we must work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pulgar Vidal. And now I would like to welcome Mrs. Isabella Matus, European Union Ambassador to Palma Euroclima. Ms. Matus, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Esteemed authorities, it is a great honor to participate in this high-level ministerial panel on the energy transition, the just transition, and share the experience, support, and commitment that the European Union offers and wants to continue offer to Latin America and the Caribbean in this energy transition, so we can advance together and move forward into the just, green, digital transition without leaving anyone behind, as we have said several times before in this panel. If the climate crisis were not enough, the Russian and Ukraine war has worsened the energy crisis, reminding the international community and Europe our dependence on fossil fuels. The energy independence and the transition into a sustainable energy is even more relevant now than ever. Always considering the geopolitical worldwide context, the just transition is important for the countries, and this is still an important loss to the European Union. Therefore, we are committed to support the Latin America and the Caribbean countries to achieve an energy transition, ensuring access to energy, economic growth, and formal employment. Energy transition is common to all the continents, but from the EU, we are aware that every country has particular challenges with starting points and different realities. Therefore, we presented the Global Gateway Investment Agenda for Latin America and the Caribbean during the summit US-LAC celebrated in Brussels to respond to the needs of each one of the countries from Latin America and the Caribbean. We identified 135 emblematic projects where the cooperation and mobilization of investment was important, where we see numerous projects related to energy transition, and we had started some of those projects, and just to name some of them to the colleagues: in Brazil, Chile, Trinidad and Tobago. In Panama, through the Euroclima program, the EU has set at its disposal our experience to formulate and execute decarbonization and sustainability strategies. For the EU, it is important to include social considerations. in our energy relations: gender equality, energy poverty, and in general, the principles of just transition that should go hand in hand with energy matters, so we don't leave anyone behind, so we can alleviate the suffering of vulnerable populations that are always the ones that suffer the most by the effects of the climate change and inequalities stemming from those changes. In that sense, COP28 is a key opportunity to transform the ever-growing political drive around energy transition, focused on concrete outcomes. Therefore, the EU has joined the presidency of the COP to promote and present in December, Dubai, a commitment on the transition towards clean energy with the aim to lead the world to 1.7 degrees Celsius and fulfill the global goals on renewable energies and efficiency. We want to triple the worldwide installed capacity of renewable energies up to 11 terabytes by 2030 and double the enhancement rate of energy efficiency in this decade compared to the previous decade. When we jointly apply these goals, this leads to a progressive elimination of the fossil fuels at a rhythm that moves along with the Paris Agreement. Also, complementing the Paris Agreement and the posterior agreements related to climate, forging a positive narrative and a space for the collective action in matters of clean energy plans. So far, we don't have a global pathway into a clean energy transition aligned with 1.5 that has been backed up by governments, and we must change that. Chile and Barbados are also part and promote such initiative. We hope that we can get more countries that publicly support the commitment. If you are interested, please don't hesitate to approach me and we can share the details with you from my program Euroclima, present here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Matus. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Oscar Guevara, Senior Executive Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Guevara, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. It is a great privilege to share this forum with ministers from the region and the different institutions organizing this Climate Week. I would like to initiate my intervention with a reflection. The spaces like the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, CAF, IDB, have a common agenda and is the spirit of multilateralism. CAF and the Paris Agreement are the results of the countries that have agreements and common goals. In our case, the creation of a bank with a spirit of regional integration and support of the sustainable development of their shareholder countries. Therefore, it is extremely important to support these forums related to the different goals coming from the Paris Agreement and especially all the efforts towards a just energy transition, precisely because this clearly reflects the spirit of multilateralism. In this case, considering that Latin America and the Caribbean is comparatively to other countries of the world, we have more photovoltaic and wind energy. However, 70% of the composition of the energy matrix in Latin America and the Caribbean is associated to fossil fuels. Therefore, we have this balance of opportunities, but we also have a great dependency on this energy matrix connected to fossil fuels. And this energy transition means deep changes in the way that we produce and the way we consume energy. I think this was also mentioned previously by other panelists, and we don't need to have just one approach based on the way we generate energy, but we need to pay attention to the way we consume energy. And within this context, our message or our reflection for this forum has three main points. One, energy transition is not a commitment that can wait, because in CAF, advancing the energy transition means to put communities at the center, to reiterate the commitment of not leaving anyone behind, precisely because the effects of the threats triggered by climate change are felt even more in those communities that are vulnerable, or those groups that are already suffering from these gaps, inequalities, income inequalities, access to infrastructure, education, and health. They are the ones suffering the impacts of extreme phenomena related to climate change. Therefore, this is our first motivation. We cannot delay the actions related to the just energy transition, and that means, first and foremost, that we need to have an approach based on communities, meaning that we are always thinking in those communities. Second, and this is, I could say that maybe this is an aspect related to the CAF, the volume of investment needed on technologies and infrastructure. So, of course, this is one of our missions, and this is one of the reasons that we have created the multilateral banking, to support countries so they can structure and mobilize resources so we can achieve our goals of investment in infrastructure and technology. And the last and third challenge is how to lead by example. It's not about just bringing a discourse and not having our own reflection and say, okay, how is the bank performing in its own operations? Since last year, for example, we assume, along with the multilateral banking and other development institutions, the goal that all the new operations must be aligned with the Paris Agreement. And beyond a milestone, this means that we reinforce our commitment, because CAF has the mission, the vision, and the backup of the shareholder countries to work in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that not only means that we need to have a discourse, but we need to reflect it in all the elements of the Paris agreements and double green operations funded by the bank. Green operations in the funding context means funding in climate change and biodiversity. And something that I would like to reiterate, especially in this space where we have the opportunity to reach representatives from countries and different institutions, organizations from the civil society and the community in general, is that CAF also has the possibility to mobilize green funds. For example, with the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund or the GEF, but organizations like CAF are created to assume the difficult tasks so the countries can support each other, so we can create ambitious projects, trans-border regional projects aiming to several of the elements that we have seen here. For example, the conservation of the Amazonian, working with local communities, the regional energy integration, or, for example, the transition into electromobility models that are efficient, that ensure access to all communities. This is the reason for these organizations like CAF. And finally, and I believe that I have mentioned this throughout my intervention, investing in a just energy transition is investing in the future of our region. We are supporting the call made from the governments, from the civil society, to commit to that transition for Latin America and the Caribbean, because we believe that this transition means to invest in a just and sustainable future for the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guevara. And lastly, we will hear a virtual message from Mrs. Maria Machala Silva, World Bank Regional Director for Infrastructure in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. Let us turn to the screen and listen to her message. Mrs. Silvia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I apologize, I'm not able to be there with you today. I would like to thank you for offering the World Bank this opportunity. This is an opportunity to highlight our commitment and support as a strategic partner in the pathway into the just transition in the region. As we heard, this is a critical aspect at the core of the conversations worldwide, with a global commitment without precedents. This is a fundamental access to achieve the worldwide goals. This is a context where contexts and countries worldwide adopt concrete goals to face the challenges posed by climate change, foreseeing that part of the strategies more countries will introduce requirements and green origin certifications on exporting products, where many enterprises are committing to be more sustainable in the supply chain and changing their production chains, where consumers worldwide, especially the younger generations and women, are even more committed with this agenda. These commitments are boosting a realignment for sustainable products or greener products. What does that mean for a region like Latin America and the Caribbean? We believe there are opportunities created because the region, as we have heard before, has natural resources, unique institutional resources that will allow the region to become a key actor in this agenda, attracting industries and green supply chains, creating new sources of employment and economic growth, because we start from a favorable position, because more than 60% of the energy comes from renewable sources, and we have wide potential because the region has a sophisticated energy markets and a substantial participation of the private sector, possible through reforms that started decades ago, because there's a huge potential in the extractive industry with an important reserve of lithium, copper, and other minerals that are critical to boost the energy transition. All those factors, considering the closeness to strategic markets and the geographic position, allows Latin America and the Caribbean to have comparative advantage in the supply of the global market and to harness the nearshoring opportunities to relocate industries in the region to reduce not only the logistic costs, but also to harness clean energies to reduce the environmental impact. And this is a concept that has been recently named as green shoring opportunities or power shoring for Latin America. We identify a great opportunity, but having said that, we must consider important aspects in this trajectory to the energy transition related to the fact that, one, many countries in Latin America are exporting economies with intensive sectors on emissions. We have heard about the agriculture sector, transportation, mining and industry that need to decarbonize their operations to continue being competitive worldwide. And in order to decarbonize sectors, the electricity demand will increase drastically. So in order to address that demand, it is extremely important to advance in new reforms and support investments for a greater incorporation of renewable energies in the generation, a greater penetration of energy markets, and considering that the region is highly exposed to variability, it is important to invest in technologies to reduce vulnerability and enhance the energy safety, promoting innovations, storing energy, supporting low carbon fuels. And this requires regulatory policies that are stable, facilitating access to funding and investment, public and private investments, as policies that will unblock opportunities to have a feasible compensation alternatives so this transition is really just and sustainable. And how do we support from the World Bank this agenda? What are we doing? Through our knowledge and exchange of experience worldwide, we support the deployment of new technologies, mobilizing financial resources, and we collaborate with other multilateral banks like CAF, IDB, and others to support the strategies of energy transition in the region. Concrete examples, for example, green hydrogen. We have worked with strategic partners in Chile to support the creation of a green hydrogen fund to mitigate the risks and attract the private investment in this industry. In Brazil, we work a project to fund the first green hydrogen hub, offering technical assistance on policies, regulations, and standards like Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica. On the decarbonization of transportation, this is one of the greater generators of emissions in the region. We support the roadmaps for a massive electrification of transportation with technical assistance on regulation for tariffs, infrastructures, and logistic hubs for green hydrogen, like we do in Panama, or the development of the corridor of lithium chains in Argentina, or electric energy loans, like in Brazil. Renewable energies, we support several countries in the region to advance the reforms and investments. A few years ago, we supported the creation of a fund in Argentina that leveraged close to $5 billion of private investment on renewable energies. And just like many of the panelists mentioned, something important is the energy efficiency, where we work on regional programs and national programs in countries of the Caribbean, Argentina, and Mexico. So this is a quick glance on how we can collaborate with this important agenda, expressing our commitment and our willingness to support however we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Silva. With this, the ministerial segment on just transition and energy transition is closed. Thank you, distinguished Excellency, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, for this important statement. Dear ministers, I look forward to seeing you again at the ministerial cocktail at 6 p.m. in room Miraflores, the same room as you were earlier. And I wish all of you the best as you continue the discussion, and you ensure you my highest consideration. This segment on just transition and energy transition is hereby adjourned. Have a nice evening.